But it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to both ICSSPE and also the conference organizers. This is a true pleasure. As noted, I've been asked, and I'm happy to speak about COVID-19 and the impact on persons with a disability. I am the president of IFAPA, the International Federation of Adapted Physical Activity, and that's the perspective I'll be speaking to as opposed to a specific research project. Adapted physical activity, as the slide suggests, is a cross-disciplinary, so it focuses on sports sociology, similar to what the presenter from the University of Toronto just mentioned earlier, epidemiology, our colleague from Denmark. So it would cover all the different disciplines with the focus on persons with a disability, again, ranging through the spectrum, including intellectual disability, physical disability, mental illness, etc. And we also focus on the broad cross-spectrum of activities, including physical education, which we deem to be absolutely crucial as it relates to persons with a disability. We are affiliated with international partners, which often get confused as being one and the same thing with IFAPA, but that's clearly not the case. And those include Special Olympics, Paralympics, and Deaflympics. And I'll be speaking to some of the programs and opportunities that COVID-19 have presented further in this presentation. So that's the what and the how of what IFAPA does, and now the why. Why do we do what we do? And we would certainly concur and agree with the 2006 United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with a Disability. And we are focusing and pursuing, and Simon talked about this from his research, this idea of equity and inclusion. And we recognize that this is absolutely crucially important for persons with a disability, and in particular, the right to participate in sport and physical activity. So that's the why of what IFAPA does. But today's presentation is focusing on the impact of COVID. And Detlef, you made reference to some of the research that's already been done by persons such as Helen. Now, there has not been a ton of research recently on persons with a disability. There will be one article in particular that I'll use as a framework and a guide. But I think it's clear that persons with disability as a vulnerable, at-risk population have even additional significant challenges in dealing with COVID as it relates to physical activity, sport, recreation, physical education, and those things include such as barriers to proper hygiene, the need to touch things from a visual impairment perhaps, existing health conditions that preclude participation. So I would argue that persons with disability are in particular impacted by COVID and the pandemic. I made reference to the one article by Fitzgerald, Stride, and Drury, who are from Leeds University in the UK, and they talked about the impact of COVID, and they were looking at 4 specific areas. So number 1 being the media, number 2, opportunities presenting for participation, and Helen was making reference to in Denmark, how many people were becoming more active or less active as a result of COVID, and certainly that's been an impact on persons with disability. The idea of inclusion, and then the last and the one that I'll be focusing on the most is the future. How does COVID potentially impact sport, physical activity, recreation, physical education for people with disabilities? So number 1, the media. I am in Western Canada right now, and so we're certainly impacted by the US media and the US sports system. When COVID first happened and sport was shutting down, I think people were perhaps hopeful that perhaps more niche physical activity in sport might get profiled. I would certainly say that did not happen from a disability sport context. And right now, this week alone, the sports landscape is returned to a focus on professional sport. So the National Football League, the picture in the top left-hand corner, starts on Thursday. College football has started in the United States. We're having playoffs taking place with the National Basketball Association. I am a Toronto Raptors fan, I will admit. Hockey playoffs are taking place in the US Open. So there is no lack of a focus on professional sport from a media perspective. And certainly there's very little, if any, comments or profile on, again, some of the smaller niche sports, and in particular, the disability sports, such as the ones that I talked about earlier from the International Paralympic Committee, Special Olympics, or Deaf Olympics. As far as opportunities go for participation to be physically active during COVID, I would argue that there were some home-based options that were presented. And if nothing else, that presents an opportunity for the future for people with disabilities. But again, I would say that the focus has been on the return to play for people who are and children who are able-bodied. And so the participation that I had at a provincial level on the return to play guidelines, again, focus more or less on the able-bodied population, with limited to any conversations that related to children in particular with disabilities. And I think that perhaps that was a lost opportunity, and moving forward, maybe it's something that we can rectify. The third kind of main theme that the authors that I spoke of earlier from Leeds talked about was looking at inclusion. Now, certainly there's been an increased focus on diversity, inclusiveness, and belonging. The Black Lives Matter movement, focusing, again, from a United States of America perspective, I think is an example of that. As far as a population and demographic, people with disabilities, there have been a couple of news articles just in the last couple of weeks from a Canadian context. So CBC News and the middle one, and the Toronto Star, which is Canada's largest daily newspaper. Concerns being expressed by parents, particularly with a return to school in a Northern Hemisphere context happening just in the last couple of weeks. Many parents are concerned about their children, and in particular, those who have disabilities, and even further more specific as it relates to physical education. And so the opportunities for those children to participate in inclusive physical education, I think, is being really challenged. And I think a lot of parents are concerned about the long-term impacts of that. So the future. So what could potentially happen for people with disabilities and the industry of sport, physical activity, recreation for people with disabilities? As I mentioned earlier, I think the increase and the effectiveness of online delivery, I think an example of it is this conference. And so, people are becoming much more adept at Zoom, much more adept at the various platforms. And so I think there's an opportunity for that to really improve access for people with disabilities. Esport, was referenced earlier. The International Wheelchair and Amputee Sport Games are going to be offering esport for the very first time this year. The Olympic Games have certainly considered offering esport. Maybe there's a chance and an opportunity for people who are able-bodied and those with disabilities now to compete against one another on a platform such as esport. Funding, certainly, again, also referenced earlier. I think the pandemic has identified, I think it was Simon who mentioned this, that, it certainly clarified some of the funding challenges and fundamental foundational issues within our system it just became more obvious because of the pandemic. Persons with disability, are they going to be left? Are they going to be forgotten as it relates to when clubs and community sport return? Will the funding be primarily focused on able-bodied children and able-bodied young adults as opposed to those with disabilities? A term called inspiration porn, which was coined by a woman out of Australia named Stella Young, I think is another possibility. And I thought of two examples. One is a film called Rising Phoenix, which was just released last week, which the International Paralympic Committee was a part of. It was released on Netflix. I admittedly quite enjoyed it. A colleague of mine, David Howe, who's a professor who I believe, Simon, at the University of Western Ontario, or Western as it's known now, stated, after all the publicity, I expected something special, yet it is the same ableist inspirational porn. So disappointing. There was another video circulating of people with disabilities putting on masks, and it was, I think, intended to show that if a person with a disability can put on a mask, well, then certainly anybody can put on a mask. a friend of mine tweeted, "Don't use disabled folks as props. I can also wipe my own bum, but that doesn't mean it doesn't need to be a video either." And so I think, again, this point of there is the potential for this idea of using people with disabilities to inspire us and encourage us, as opposed to be seen for their athleticism or their economic might. I think there's a possibility of that happening too. I think there is a hope, anyways, that the COVID and the focus on online training could lead to greater education. So 2 examples I think that are promoted here is the 4th International Webinar based in Israel, and also the lockdown games. And actually, congratulations to ICSSPE for focusing on the Inclusion Club and hosting one of the founders of the Inclusion Club a few weeks ago to talk about inclusive online opportunities. So again, I think there are some real positive opportunities that could result from the COVID-19. Just a few more slides on the future. There's the line that, you never want to waste a good crisis, and that, that need is the mother of all invention. And so I think COVID and the pandemic could result in some really innovative ways of dealing with physical activity for people with disabilities. And the masks, I think, are just 2 examples there. So the one on the left, allowing persons to be able to see speaking, and so to read lips. And the one on the right is actually a mask that's hooked up to Bluetooth. And so again, the ability to have technology enable people to participate more fully in society. And then finally, programming. And so, again, just 3 small examples of programs that have occurred or have started shortly after the pandemic started in March. And so a Special Olympics program in Kenya that's being sponsored by UNICEF, a virtual at-home program being offered in the United States. So the gentleman in the yellow shirt being offered by some university colleagues in Canada, and the Inside Track portal, which has been created by the Singapore Disability Sports Council. All of these things are now being offered online to encourage participation and activity in the home. And perhaps this will encourage and allow even more people with disability the opportunity to participate fully. And then the final possible advantage is what's referred to as handy-capitalism. 10 to 15% of the world's population have a disability, and perhaps industry, corporations, businesses, sectors see people with disabilities as an untapped potential to return from the pandemic. Travel would be an example of that. The travel industry has been absolutely pummeled by people not traveling internationally on flights. An example of it being this conference not taking place. And so Japan doesn't benefit from us coming there and spending our money in hotels and restaurants. And so certainly the travel and tourism industry will need to rebound. Perhaps a way of doing that is making themselves more accessible. And I think you're seeing, certain locales doing that, and perhaps they'll be the beneficiary then of more people coming who do have disabilities. So with that, I want to express again my appreciation to both ICSSPE and the Yokohama Sport